Katharine Suding is a leader in community ecology. She applies empirical and theoretical approaches to address both fundamental and applied problems faced by ecological communities in today's changing world. Her presentation, which is entitled Resilience, Recovery, and the Ecology of Change. Please help me welcome our MacArthur Lecture speaker, Dr. Katie Suding.
Thank you. It's great to be here today. It's an honor. It's such a pleasure to follow in MacArthur's footsteps. I hope today I can exemplify his influence on transforming ecology, particularly by linking ecological theory to patterns of natural history, as well as translating those linkages to problems in resource management and conservation. What I want to start off with, though, first are thanks. It is amazing to have this sort of honor, and there's no way that I could have done it without a lot of people. One thing that's great about ecology and ESA as a society is its collaborative spirit. And it's the people working with people, debating, getting inspired, working with such a diverse group that really makes me excited to do this work and to contribute every day. I'd like to first thank my mentors, Deborah Goldberg, Kay Gross, Scott Collins, Richard Hobbs, Tim Seastead, for giving me such inspiration and such advice to follow in their footsteps. I couldn't have done this without you. I also want to thank my peers that do such excellent work, as well as my peers in other disciplines that have just allowed me to ask naive questions and been eager to explore new territory with me. And lastly, most importantly, I'd like to thank all the students and postdocs that I have been it's been a pleasure to work with. They are amazing group of people, and I'm so proud of all their accomplishments. All of what I say today, all of it has been inspired by work with them. I want to end by thanking funding agencies and community partners and allowing me to be able to translate the fundamental science to community, local, engaged work. And just one last thanks, and then I'll move on. But I also want to thank my family. I think that most people understand that even something that you like so much, there are times where uncertainty arises and you ask, is this really what I want to do? And it's great to be surrounded by people who say, are you kidding? You love this. And I really do love it. And I really do thank people for all those supports. I particularly want to thank my father, a geologist who took me into the field every summer as a kid, an unfailing supporter who died a couple weeks ago. I hope that I can pass on that spark of curiosity in the natural world to my kids, as well as to anyone else that crosses my path. Okay, I want to start today pointing out something that is clear to everyone in this room. The environment is changing, and it's changing due to human impact. This is a problem that is not new to us. It was highlighted by Peter Vitousek in his MacArthur lecture 16 years ago. It is past debate, and it is happening now. And as John Oliver says, to even debate about climate change is like asking, do owls exist? Which number is bigger? Or my favorite, are there hats? Okay, so I'm going to start with the idea that the climate is changing, and the biggest challenge facing us as a discipline, is the ecological consequences of that change. We are living in a very different world than the one that MacArthur worked in. Patterns of natural history distorted in ways that I'm sure he didn't anticipate. Our discipline, we're moving past assumptions of equilibrium that he largely worked in, and us facing this uncertain, fairly scary future that I am sure he wouldn't have ever imagined. We know that we're entering new unknown territory with the magnitude of these environmental changes that are occurring. The change is more rapid than we ever have experienced in the past, and a mix of several compounding drivers of those changes: climate, land use, invasive species, extreme disturbances. But as we enter this new territory, also ecology, we have been working on these issues about how the environmental template and drivers affect biotic interactions for decades. And we do have a lot of baseline to know, or to at least expect, what we should anticipate. For instance, responses of these ecological systems should we anticipate, and we actually know in many cases, are a mixture of responses at the genetic, at the physiological, at the population, at the community, and at the ecosystem levels. And all these responses simultaneously will yield however an ecosystem will respond to environmental change. We also know that in these changes ahead of us, that they're going to hit, and they are hitting, all the ecosystems that we work in across all of the places that we work. We work wild landscapes, managed landscapes, we strongly impacted, working landscapes, cultural landscapes, and urban landscapes. It's going to hit everything we work on, everywhere we work. And I guess it's not surprising that when you look at papers published in ecology over the last several decades, over 50% of the papers are working on topics related to the ecological consequences of environmental change. We're working on this problem a lot. It is clear. It's one of the most challenging problems that's going to face our discipline in our lifetimes. I want to contrast this, though. I want to contrast this with how our science is being translated to environmental management. And I want to ascertain that we're largely translating our science in a very static manner. For instance, when we talk about restoration and we study recovery of degraded systems, it's largely based on assumption of a historic baseline sometime in the past, or reference systems and some baseline in the present. But when we think about how we are dealing with these references, when we measure recovery, it's usually towards one single site at one single time point. We're trying to hit a target with little spatio-temporal variation allowed. Resilience has been increasingly used in environmental management as a way to make sense of all these environmental changes, but only insofar as resilience meaning stability and the ability to absorb change. In a recent review about management recommendations in forests related to climate change, found that 86% of all management recommendations were to maintain existing patterns and processes. And while the human side of the climate change coin has adopted ideas about adaptation and adaptive capacity, there's been few recommendations in the natural ecological sciences side. And rarely, when those recommendations are made, they are rare to be implemented due to high uncertainty and high risk. Do we really know what we're doing in these cases? Do we really know enough to intervene and to make those recommendations a success? So I want to point out now that we're at this this area that it puts me a little bit at ease. We're dealing with this idea that the environment is changing. It's changing rapidly, but we aren't really translating our recommendations to effective, sustainable management. And this, I think, a lot of it has to stem for our translation of science and how we're dealing with change. On one side, often our management goals are to keep ecology as unchanged as possible, thinking about resilience as the ability to absorb change, and thinking about recovery back to a single reference. But we know from decades of work and a lot of our current work that ecological change is to be expected, that a self-sustaining, healthy system, you should expect turnover in genotypes, species, functional groups, and that actually those are the processes that are key to maintaining diversity and are key to understand diversity if we are able to preserve, maintain, or restore it. So there's a disconnect here. And it's interesting, actually. People in studying ethics and philosophy have identified this disconnect in ecology. And they point to a couple of reasons why. Why is this? Why could this be? And one thing that they point to is if we really start talking about ecological change and managing for change in ecological systems, then we release this constraint of historical baselines or benchmarks in our science. And once we release that, we almost go rudderless, and we open up us to the possibility of anything goes. What is good change? What is bad change? How do we navigate? How do we understand what trajectory different systems might be going on? And I think this is a key for the next, our discipline in the next decade. That it's not change and whether our systems are changed, but the challenge is the many flavors of change. How we describe change, how we measure change, how we describe different trajectories and identify the control points on those trajectories where we can modify and guide ecological systems to certain outcomes versus others. And this is what I want to focus on today. This is a monstrous challenge, and one that's pretty intimidating. And so I want to bring, I think it's going to take a lot of tools and skill sets of a large amount of people to really get this done. I want to talk a little bit today about my experiences and my work with me and some of my colleagues in kind of making progress in terms of the ecological consequences of environmental change. And I want to start here. One reason I got interested in ecology in the first place is the web of interactions that ecological communities are characterized for, by the complexity, by all these interesting different organisms that are all interacting together and making the system what it is. And I imagine that many of you also were interested in ecology or got interested in ecology, kind of our similar interests. And I've been spending the last several decades thinking about this ball of interactions, if you want to describe it that way, and thinking about what external drivers can do to this ball of interactions. So how these external drivers kick this ball, whether it's a humongous boot down the field or whether it's a sustained dribble. And what are the ecological consequences of all those kicks to this ball of interactions? You can think about this ball as many different components, depending on what you study. Individuals, genotypes, species, resources that are flowing to different compartments of an ecosystem. And the lines connecting these components, interactions, both positive and negative. And there's many ways that these external drivers can affect this ball of interactions, or this community. One of the simplest ways, and one of the ways that we largely oftentimes assume that will happen, is that external drivers will affect components of the system. Interactions really not that important, and then they'll translate pretty simply to an ecological response. But there's other ways and outcomes. One is that the external drivers can cause responses in a system, but the internal dynamics of the system compensate, moderate for those kicks to the system. And actually, the biotic system really doesn't change all that much. Another way that these external drivers can have consequences is through really surprising effects, where the direct effects on particular components within a system actually get changed and moderated by interactions, and actually other components of the system are the most responsive. There's a lot of different scenarios that could happen. And I want to talk about work that my lab and I have done to try to better understand how this complex system is responding to these external drivers. The approach we have taken is that we have used a combination of long-term observational data with experimental approaches that manipulate both the external drivers as well as the internal structure of the communities. And then lastly, population modeling using both experimental data and long-term observational data. And these approaches have allowed us to determine or better see how the direct effects of these environmental drivers, as well as the environmental dependence of all the internal dynamics that we study so much in ecology. Growth rates when rare, invasions, feedbacks, negative frequency dependence, density dependence. I want to share with you a couple of the results that we have found. In the serpentine grassland, a grassland in California, we have found that species are responsive to rainfall when they are rare. But this response is heavily moderated at the population level due to strong negative frequency dependence. So the interactions with conspecifics, intraspecific interactions, moderate these rainfall effects, resulting in actually very muted responses of these species to rainfall. And in fact, it's the species that respond the most strongly to rainfall in this community are ones that actually don't respond that strongly to rainfall when they are rare, but that they have very weak negative frequency dependence. So that response can translate to population dynamics. In the alpine tundra, we have found that the dominant species strongly respond to environmental change drivers through experimental manipulations. But the subordinate and rare species really don't see those external drivers, and they are responding to whatever the dominant species are doing. When we remove the dominant species from the system, we find that a mixture of negative and positive interactions with the dominant species allow for the structuring of the community and this maintenance of the super high diversity to exist. In the Carrizo Plains, we studied a record drought that occurred in the mid 2014, 2015. And this record drought was super stressful on the system. It caused vegetative cover to be reduced to about 12%. Amazingly extreme event. And yes, this caused a decline in most species. But we found actually, surprisingly, that rare species actually increased due to this event. That they actually increased in this very harsh environment due to competitive release, because their abundance and their interactions were so strongly structured by the other species that because those other species did poorly, the rare species actually did better. In native grasslands in California, we found that there's the strong feedbacks through the soil community stabilize that community and allow it to be strongly resilient to external drivers like increased nitrogen inputs. And so they are able to persist way beyond what you'd imagine or what you'd predict based on direct environmental nitrogen effects. And this creates a path dependence versus recovery and response, or hysteresis, where these native grasslands are able to maintain their identity and structure at nitrogen levels far beyond what you'd expect. But if you were going to start a native grassland from low abundances, that would only be possible at very, very low nitrogen inputs. In California rangelands that are comprised mostly by two functional groups, annual forage grasslands and annual forbs, we found that competitive variability actually allows this rare group, the forbs, to persist. And this is due to competitive nonlinearities, where these forbs are competitively released due to, in some climate situations, in this case, particular early season drought. And so it's this climate variability that allows for persistence of both functional groups in this system. And then lastly, across all these studies that I talked about, we find again and again that the responses that we're seeing in the ecological community are not just due to the current climate conditions, but there's all sorts of temporal lags in response. And to give you one example, in California annual grasslands, we find that the response to rainfall in a given community is dictated about half to the current year's conditions, and half of the response is temporally lagged at least 1 year. So last year's rainfall. This is due to all sorts of mechanisms like seed bank, regeneration dynamics, and actually just fundamentally different response rates with species with just different life history traits. So think about this, and I got interested in ecology due to these types of interactions, and looking at them very mechanistically, I find that it is the variations in the way these interactions are organized among species that translates to how they're responding to external drivers. And even though this is what was interesting and really drives a passion to studying these ecological communities, time and time again, I find it so surprising, amazing, that these internal dynamics can be so strong and matter so much in our ability to translate how these environmental changes will affect ecological response. It is amazing. The biological organization within a system can be as important, and sometimes we find even more important than any impact of the external driver itself. What amazing complex systems that we study. It is great. So let's take a step back and talk about what I was focusing on today, that we've been doing these works based on trying to translate them to management and what we should do in situations for conservation, for restoration. And does this information help? Is it helpful? Does it help correct some of this disconnect that I pointed out before? And I want to say, yes, I think it does, at least to a little bit. And let me give you some examples. In the native of California grasslands, we are able to work with managers to identify areas where there's low nitrogen inputs and a best ability to restore these grasslands, as well as areas with really high nitrogen availabilities that unfortunately we have to think about alternative futures and really can't figure out ways to reestablish these grasslands. We also can work with them in these intermediate zones of nitrogen inputs, thinking about the importance of maintaining established grasslands, maintaining those soil feedbacks, because those are key to the persistence of this system. And then another example in California rangelands, being able to work with ranchers and understand that the coexistence between these different functional groups, forbs and the annual forage grasses, actually might matter to ranchers. It might matter to ranchers not in those years that are great forage years where the annual grasses do wonderfully, but matter to ranchers in the years with early season drought, where those grasses don't do well. And it's these years that they need to maintain the forbs, the other functional groups in the system, in order to stabilize forage production for their economic benefit and to be able to feed their cattle. So yes, we have been able to translate a little bit. But stepping back even further, I don't think we're translating enough. And I bring up again and again this quote from philosopher Donald Shawn, who's talking about the challenges of translating science, technical knowledge, to societal problems. And I want to just read, part of what he says. In the varied topography of professional practice, there is a high, hard ground overlooking a swamp. On the high ground, manageable problems lend themselves to solutions through use of research-based theory and technique. In the swampy lowlands, problems are messy and confusing. The irony of this situation is that the problems on the high ground tend to be relatively unimportant to individuals or society at large, however great their technical interests might be. While in the swamp lies problems of greatest human concern. The practitioner is confronted with a choice. Shall she, so pardon my little edit there, remain on the high ground where she can solve relatively unimportant problems according to her standards of rigor? Or shall she descend to the swamp of important problems where she cannot be rigorous in any way she knows how to describe? On reflection and thinking about how to address this kind of grand challenge about what are the ecological consequences of all these environmental changes that are hitting our system, I would say I've been kind of walking around the swamp, maybe getting my feet wet, but not really diving in. And I think we all should consider wading into this swamp, really getting deep, really thinking about translating to really solve these. And if that's uncomfortable, forming a team with people that do wade in this swamp. And so to think about how we might do this and how we might be able to translate all our knowledge about these complex systems a little bit better to address the societal problem of environmental change. I've come up with a couple of recommendations, and I find these a little bit insufficient, I have to say, but at least it might be a start. And so I'd like to start with 4 probably insufficient recommendations. And I'm gonna describe these in terms of these 4 terms: certainty, flexibility, ecological integrity, and adaptive capacity. So when we think about this problem that we're facing, this problem of translating environmental changes to ecological responses, and then being able to suggest good policy alternatives or management techniques to address those, we're dealing with a multi-layered problem. For instance, for climate change, climate models, downscaling climate models to our local situations, translating those climate effects and exposure to different parts of the landscape that have different resource availabilities and resource limitations. Then also translating once again to how these different changes in resource limitation and stress affect the ecological interactions that we know to be so important. And then lastly, how those effects might be translated to effects of policy and changes in human behavior that will certainly loop back to every one of these other components. That is a lot of translation to go through. And I want to argue, and I've been thinking about this a lot, that this is inherently highly uncertain. And that we should think about how much we should take time to only do mechanistic work and only really focus on that. And how much time we should say, hey, I think there's something happening, but I'm okay with some uncertainty because this is an inherently uncertain problem. Bill Sutherland, in a 2006 Tansley lecture, said, "The ability to predict consequences of a given change would lead ecology to be taken more seriously." And I think I've grown a little bit about this, but I think he hits a point that if we're say we just need more information, and we're never going to be able to make a prediction, even acknowledging and communicating the high uncertainty, then we're doing the rest of the world a disservice. And so we really need to know when it's okay to go down a trail, even if it's super, super foggy. So we need to know about when to act, when there's too much risk to act. And so thinking about risk as a component that we should be studying, and how much analysis we need to eliminate unwanted risk. But then also acknowledging just because there's high uncertainty doesn't mean that we should act, and we should suggest, and we should innovate, and we should experiment. Flexibility directly relates to this idea about uncertainty. That due to all these dynamics that we're finding in ecological systems, particularly with this unprecedented rate of environmental change, nonlinearities, non-stationarity in environmental factors, feedbacks, highly interactive systems, we expect strong path dependence, multiple trajectories that could take place in any of the systems that we are studying. And so to actually use that as a template of our study would be highly prudent. Not expect that we should know exactly which one, but think about these trajectories of change together as a suite of possibilities heading into the future. When we do this, there is ramifications to how we manage and how we set policy. One of the reactions to this concern that if we start acknowledging change and the ecological systems will change, that this is anything goes phenomenal will occur, leads a lot of regulation and policy to formulate very rigid standards, right? Because we don't want the anything goes scenario to ensue. So then adding on that we need to be flexible in our policies, we really need to guide that with rigorous quantitative ways to understand these trajectories of change. And I want to just give you one example where we find that this kind of rigidity in management and policy actually is affecting how we are able to navigate this new territory, this new world of ecological change. When we work with ranchers across the Western United States, and we talk to them about how they're adapting to climate change and drought in particular, one of the things they repeatedly bring up is how they would like to be able to adapt. They'd like to be able to change up their grazing practices. But on public land, they're unable to because of regulations and rules that federal agencies have put into place, and put into place for very good reasons, right? Put into place to enable good stewardship of public lands. But this is not really working right now. If the ranchers have to start changing their practices and start having to adapt to more climate variability, with seasons starting or ending later, with systems being able to support more or less cattle. And so having that flexibility and really giving the science to, so that the managers can formulate the flexibility in the policy really is key. And lastly, I have to say that if we're going to advocate more flexibility and navigate that, we have to also really, really advocate for more and more monitoring frameworks. It is the only way that we'll be able to know how these ecological systems are changing, and also advocate for rigorous, repeated analysis of those responses to change. Third, I want to bring up this term, ecological integrity. And actually, this is a term that used in several papers trying to inform international restoration standards for some of the work done by the United Nations, and really struggling to figure out, what are we meaning? How do we manage a system, and what is success? Mark Sagoff, another philosopher, describes this kind of disconnect between how the international policy documents describe biodiversity success and how we measure it. And he says, it is difficult to know what environmental protection is supposed to protect, and hard to know what can be counted as ecological gains or losses, based on the words that are reflected in international biodiversity goals. For instance, sustainability, manage and protect, maintain ecological integrity, keep impacts within safe ecological limits, safeguard ecosystem health, strengthen resilience. And I think all of us in this room, we have a general feeling what we mean. We do. We have this impression, we kind of know what they mean. But it's super hard to quantify this. And when in a recent review by Donahue in 2016, looked at measures of ecological stability, for instance, and found that we are focusing on just a single metric, often largely biomass, but we're missing the quantification, the multidimensional quantification of changing nature. And I think that's really important, even given about what I've been talking about how important the system response is and this web of interactions and how it's changing it. And if you think about what these words are that are being used in international policy documents, ecological integrity, sustainability, ecosystem health, those are all measurements that are referring to this multidimensional complex system. Other disciplines have hit this as well, hit this need to be able to quantitatively translate these ideas about complexity to use. In physics, in information theory, in economics. So we can borrow from these fields and we can translate how an ecological system is responding to these changes for multidimensional metrics. And for instance, just as an example, we can order systems based on their spatial patterns, their temporal patterns, patterns with the interactions across different components, from disordered systems to ordered systems using such metrics as Shannon entropy. And interestingly, it's likely that sweet spot in the middle that was what we are referring to when we're referring to self-sustainable ecological integrity in terms of our systems. So this high level of complexity that is not highly ordered, that is something that we know we need to avoid and characterizes a lot of strongly human structured systems, as well as highly disordered. And lastly, I want to end with an idea about how we can continue lots of mechanistic work, but thinking about a little bit of a different component of mechanism. and that is through adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity has been an idea related to resilience, but really carried forth thinking about human societies and how humans will adapt to change. And here's a definition from the IPCC report in 2001. The ability of a system to adjust to climate change, to moderate potential damages, to take advantage of opportunities, and to cope with the consequences. So very human-centered definition. But I think there's a lot of potential to think about ecological systems in the same light. And we might not know the future direction that environmental change will take ecological systems, but we can think about building these systems up and what it takes to build up the adaptive capacity so they're able to deal with whatever the future holds, whether it's resilience building, whether it's vulnerability reducing, or whether it's transformation enabling. And we don't have to decide, but we can develop and we can look at mechanisms to enable the system's adaptive capacity. One of the central tenets in adaptive capacity that has high relevance to ecology is something called response diversity, where instead of thinking about taxonomic diversity, think about functional responses and making sure that there are a lot of different trajectories that the system will be able to take through genetic turnover, species turnover, changes in ecosystem function. And it's this idea about making sure systems have high response diversity that might be key to ensuring adaptive capacity and the ability of our systems to persist in light of environmental change. One way to operationalize this is thinking about functional traits and borrowing ideas from evolutionary biology, such as adaptive landscapes. So thinking about phenotypes, connecting it to fitness, and thinking about that there's a lot of different directions where different traits and components of a community could be reflective in different adaptive trajectories. And that some trajectories might not be adaptive, and some trajectories might be neutral. And so better understanding that through the lens of functional traits. We're working on thinking about adaptive capacity and talking to managers about how to do this. And I want to just give you two quick examples of that. You think of adaptive capacity in place, how to make the system right there be more able to adapt to whatever the future holds. And we're working with the city of Boulder, thinking about seed banks and grasslands as perhaps the place that we should be monitoring. And we should be looking for response diversity. And maybe we should be intervening and thinking about how we can augment that response diversity in the seed bank, just in case, right? Just in case whatever changes ensure in the future. You can also think about adaptive capacity in space. And Claire Kremen and Adina Marylander have done some really, really important work on this in this aspect, thinking about the importance of diversifying managed landscapes, cultural landscapes, urban landscapes, everywhere, so that species have the ability to move in space and have that ability to adapt as the environment changes. So I know that's probably just a starting of a step, but I urge people with different skill sets and different ways of looking at things to consider these ideas and consider whether they are ways to move forward and really making meeting this challenge. of knowing that the ecological systems will change. And so navigating that change, thinking about the different trajectories of that change, quantifying it, and thinking about control points in those trajectories that we might be able to intervene to guide ecosystem change one way or the other. So uncertainty, flexibility, ecological integrity, or other metrics. Adaptive capacity as perhaps a really powerful mechanism. And I want to end today with kind of a vision over the next decade or two. I really hope that society starts looking more and more to ecology, to start answering questions about future vision of change. I'd like them to look, and I'd like them to be able to feel like they have enough answers from our science, so they're okay saying, okay, our ecological systems will change. These are the ways, possibility that about how they will change, and that they feel secure and confident that they can guide change in as far as they can, and that they're not accepting this anything goes scenario, that they're still being good stewards of the land, and we are still managing our important natural systems in a prudent, safe way. And maybe another way to put it a little bit more closer to home. Here's a picture of Boulder in the early 1900s. We can document a lot of ecological change that has occurred on this landscape right outside campus from then to now, in the grasslands, in the forests. We understand pretty well the mechanisms behind those changes. But right now, what I'm being asked right now from city planners and ecologists that work in Boulder systems is, what is it going to look like in 2050 when the climate of Boulder is predicted to be like Albuquerque? And I can give some solutions, and maybe they're a little bit helpful. The systems, the biological structures of the ecological systems that they work in are really strong. The interactions are very important. And likely those interactions are going to dictate a lot of the trajectory of change. We know there might be some surprises, but we're also pretty sure that probably the systems are not going to look just like Albuquerque's, and we shouldn't manage them for that type of turnover. We also can help them thinking about adaptive capacity and how they might be able to monitor and use their monitoring frameworks to better assess how that change is occurring and where we can intervene, particularly if there's dramatic, undesirable change. But I hope over the next decade, we'll be able to be even more helpful and be able to speak more about how do we quantify this change, how do we describe it, and how do we really provide solutions, knowing that the system, yes, will change, understanding that ecological components of change well enough to say, you don't have to manage to try to keep everything intact. You can successfully manage to guide these trajectories. And I want to end just one more thing. I hope that people are willing to jump in and think about the marsh and think about the translation about our science from the high ground, traveling between the high ground and the marsh being a lot of these questions that I think really face us in the next decade to come. Thanks a lot.